via voice chat. All right. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Mahon, and I'm the creative lead at the Occult Triangle Lab, a one-man indie game studio based in Brooklyn. I'm also the product development manager for Loresmyth, a tabletop RPG publisher based in the Netherlands. If you're listening to this talk, then you care about narrative design in video games. Some of you may be very new to game design, some of you may be pretty seasoned veterans, but I'm going to try to meet you all kind of in the middle. Now, this is not a talk about tabletop RPGs, but D&D is a great starting point to talk about player agency and planning for different paths. So let's take a slight detour into that world, just for a second here. For those of you who aren't familiar, the basic pitch for Dungeons and Dragons is it's a role-playing game where you can do anything. Naturally, this means that D&D is infamous for going right off the rails. A DM may have created a big evil bad guy for the players to fight, allies for them to meet, and quests to go on, but the sheer freedom given to players means that they can go off and do something totally different. I've had players choose to write a nonfiction self help book. I've had players stop the adventure to set up a whaling business in a seaport. And I've had them attempt to destabilize the power structure of an entire continent. Here's the thing, they all found that stuff fun. And as someone who sat down with a lot of players and watched their minds work in real time, I've learned that most players relish freedom, and believe it or not, they relish the consequences. They like feeling powerful, and they love feeling like their actions have real weight. Now, one of the advantages of D&D is that you can improvise stuff on the fly. You can make up new characters, new encounters, new scenes. So if a player says, "Screw it, I want to burn down this tavern instead of paying our bill," you can roll with that. With video games, you have to plan things out. You have to think about what options you want to give the players, and most of all, you want to provide them with a memorable story. So that brings us to the topic of narratives. Story rich games like Mass Effect, Disco Elysium, and Deus Ex prove that players really engage with a well told story. It's not just RPGs. God of War, The Last of Us, and The Wolf Among Us all lean heavily on their stories. Usually, first-person game or first-time game developers think their narrative is going to look like the line on the left, linear. It goes point, 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 ending. Or they think their game is going to look like the graph on the right, where it just sprawls out. The first option is linear. The game goes through exactly the way the developer intended, with no real options to change what the character does. This is the most consistent way to design a narrative because the player is seeing everything you want them to see and experiencing the game in one coherent way. The second option is to go to the other extreme. You give the player major game changing decisions that lead to more big consequential decisions. Multiple paths, multiple endings, massive replayability, all the stuff that we kind of look for when it comes to the idea of branching narratives. Most developers avoid these two extremes, but if we recognize that players want meaningful choice, that presents a problem beyond just creating more work for those, making the narrative itself. How do you give players three or four different routes to choose from without splitting your game into three or four totally different stories? More importantly, how do you keep the identity of the game intact when four different players can have four significantly different experiences? The answer is to make a narrative that's multifaceted. We're going to talk about what that means and how to write a narrative like that, but first let's talk about gameplay, stories, and plots in games. So, in games, the division between story and gameplay can get fuzzy, because whatever the player is doing is technically part of the story. If Agent 47 from Hitman decides to kill one target by walking up to him and shooting him directly in the face, rather than making their death look like an accident from falling down the stairs, he's changing the story. The target was always going to die, but the player changed how. On the other hand, some players talk about memorable early in game encounters with bandits in titles like Fallout 3 as if they're epic stories in themselves. I was low on ammo, health was about half. I'm trying to get to Megaton, but out of nowhere I was ambushed by a bunch of raiders. In their mind, that's part of their character's rise to being a hero. It's part of their personal story with the game. This creates a bit of confusion between gameplay and story. If the story has a big significant branch in it, like leaving Cade and Alenko to die in Mass Effect 1, spoilers, usually it has some big gameplay impacts too. Namely, you can't have Caden in your party in any subsequent game. You just don't get access to his skills. Ideally, games weave gameplay and story together. So gameplay evokes what the story is about, and the events of the story get tied to what the player is doing. Now, traditionally, players draw a very strong line between what's gameplay and what's the plot with a capital P. The plot is the planned content, the stuff with cutscenes and voice actings and big impacts on what happens in the game world. However, as a narrative designer, you shouldn't be separating the two in your head. Gameplay and narrative are always going to be linked. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at Skyrim. So, for example, Skyrim is a title most people recognize. Here's an approximate representation of the choices presented to the player in that game. You can see the graph on the left. You'll notice that all the branching paths have dead ends. This includes deciding whether to join the Stormcloaks or the Imperials for the Civil War, whether you decide to destroy or continue the Dark Brotherhood, and all kinds of other choices. These plot cul-de-sacs force the player to go back to the main plotline of the game when they've taken those paths to their logical conclusion. That's why players usually react to all the choices in Skyrim like the donkey in the picture. Um, they're sitting there with all their side quests, and the main quest is just sort of neglected. In Skyrim, you can be the Archmage of Winterhold, the leader of the Companions, the Thieves Guild, the Dark Brotherhood, and a member of the College of Bards. You can do and be anything. But at the end of the day, you still got to go to Sovngarde and kill Alduin, because that's what a hero does. The main narrative is pretty much set in stone, but you can spend 100 hours in that game without touching it. That should give you pause from a narrative design standpoint, because this makes the themes of the game more diluted. Instead of presenting you a story about the past coming to haunt Skyrim in the form of Alduin, Skyrim is about the exploration, it's about the freedom. That's not to say it doesn't have themes. The entire game is embroiled in themes of revolution, nationalism, racial tensions, xenophobia. However, when Alduin gets there, all that stuff is moved to the background. The most important question is whether you save the world. Alduin doesn't have a lot of narrative or thematic complexity to him, he just wants to eat the world. You don't want that. So Skyrim is an example of a game where the narrative has become so fragmented and diluted based on player freedom of choice that the game's narrative is pretty much the last thing you care about. And that's despite having one major plotline where the end is always basically the same. This is a game that doesn't branch narratively. And yes, you can have a huge impact on different parts of the game, but the narrative will always be roughly about the same. Um, Now, if we go to look at something like Deus Ex, we see something very different, but similar. So the original Deus Ex is infamous for having, different ways to approach a situation. And the original Deus Ex has a much tighter narrative too, with a stronger plot tying all the events together. As opposed to Skyrim, it's not exploration driven, it's story driven. Here's the thing though. Deus Ex and later titles like Deus Ex, Human Revolution even is a great example. That's the sequel to Deus Ex. Most of the choices and branches happen on the gameplay level, not the narrative level. There are, of course, big ending decisions and gameplay choices tied to the themes of the game, like do you become more augmented, or do you keep yourself free of technology? But there aren't many significant moments where the narrative branches, where the story itself changes based on a player's decision. There are variations that happen based on player choices, but these are mostly surface level details, not narrative changing detours. They might meet certain characters or see unique dialogue based on what decisions they've made, but that's about it. Deus Ex is legendary for giving players a lot of engaging ways to handle a situation, but the narrative freedom given to the player is restricted. This is an example of a game with strong narrative cohesion, but it's not giving the player agency to really change the story in meaningful ways. So, with all that in mind, we've talked a lot about the intersection of gameplay and story so far. And we found that even though Deus Ex and Skyrim are vastly different games, they both give players a lot of choices, but the stories themselves, the ones they're telling, really don't change based on the player's decisions. Not significantly, not in a narratively satisfying sort of way. So let's focus a little more on narrative design using D&D as an example again. Back in high school, I played a lot of D&D with a group of about 7 people. Eventually, our DM got burned out and he asked if anyone wanted to DM in his stead. I said I'd give it a shot. I knew nothing about encounter design, challenge ratings, or power creep in games, but I knew D&D narratives looked something like this. I'm going to show you an example. There's a quest given to the players. There's some travel involved. There's some combat or some puzzles, some kind of challenges. There's a climactic fight, and then there's a reward. You might recognize this because it's the formula for any generic quest in an MMO. It's also remarkably similar to this. This is the Freitag triangle, and it's the template for most short stories. It's simple, it's compact, and it's got everything you need for a story: an inciting event, tension, challenges, climax, and an ending. What this image is graphing is tension. It starts low, rises in intensity, peaks, and then falls off. It's a good formula for a side quest or an individual mission because the amount of time and effort to put into something like this is minimal. It's just setup, challenge, climax, and payoff. However, there's a tendency in game design to use this structure for overarching narratives as well, not just one-off, side quests or small stories. In a lot of games, you start low and things keep escalating over the course of the game. A lot of role-playing games, RPGs, use it because those types of games naturally escalate as you get higher levels, better equipment, more tools. The other reason the Freitag triangle is prevalent is because video games generally put players in a gameplay loop that's conducive to it. You shoot the bad guys, you collect the loot, you move on. You find a puzzle, you figure it out, you move on. There's not a lot of flexibility when you're looping the same kind of activity over and over. So most game narratives follow this structure. They either start small and continually escalate, or they start with a bang and keep adding on bigger and bigger challenges until the climax. There is another way, however, to structure your narratives that offers more flexibility, variety, and chances for meaningful player expression. Here's what it looks like. This is a really simplified version of a 3-part dramatic structure. It's heavily used in movies and novels, and you've probably seen it around. What this structure does is twofold. It provides emotional highs and lows that are immediately intuitive to players or viewers, and it provides you with funnel points in games where many possible choices are narrowed down to just a few meaningful ones. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But here's the important thing for now. The key emotional beats are the turning point, the lowest point, the rally, and the finale. Those are when the player is getting immersed in the game. Uh, those are when you're establishing and exploring your themes. Those are when the player feels the full weight of the story's themes hitting them. And finally, those are when the player is embodying those themes. In the end, your narrative is probably going to look something like this. You'll notice that there's a couple key points where the narrative branches off into different paths. I'm going to advise that the places where you put those branching, narrative paths in your game should line up with the points on this graph. Most significantly, the turning point, lowest point, the rally, and the finale. So in this structure, narrative path structure, players are brought to places where the narrative branches significantly. They explore a unique route based on their choices, and then they are brought back to the main thread again and again and again to make more key decisions that lead to more divergent paths. Unlike most games, however, when your players rejoin the root narrative, they're going to be viewing the same narrative events through vastly different perspectives. Now, I just dropped a whole bunch of stuff on you. I dropped a narrative structure. I dropped the different parts of a 3-act structure on you. And I'm saying, oh, now they're going to come back to the main narrative with different perspectives. What are you talking about? This is getting really confusing. Well, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about multifaceted stories. And hopefully, as we go through this, it's all going to start to fall into place. So, my main idea is that multifaceted stories are how you manage branching paths in a game and how you keep the game coherent, even if players have vastly different sorts of experiences. Now, you can think of your game's narrative as an object with different faces or facets. A 3-sided pyramid is a good example. Think of the base of the pyramid as the question or main theme you want to explore in your game. That's the bottom of the pyramid. It's the one that's like sitting on the ground. Now, the main questions or themes that you want to explore might be, can machines display true humanity? Do we have free will? That's the kind of the main theme or questions of Near Automata. Is it possible to accept someone's disabilities without it defining them? That's the main question of Katawa Shoujo. And finally, Undertale's main question. Can love, mercy, and understanding really replace violence as a force for change? These are the key questions at the hearts of these games. And as you're outlining the narrative for your game, you should be considering different answers to your foundational questions. These different answers are going to form the basis for your different player routes and your narrative branches. Essentially, you're going to be exploring different answers to the central question of your game through these branches. So, this brings us to our first narrative design principle. Create a complex narrative with multiple facets that can coexist so your story's routes are meaningful and coherent. There's a lot to unpack here. The key is to create compelling approaches to the same question, multiple compelling approaches, not just creating 3 different paths for Paragon, Renegade, or Neutral. The reason for this is that each of these paths is going to connect to the narrative structure we talked about earlier. Depending on what route your player takes, their turning point, lowest low, rally points, and finales are going to be different, as well as their climax. So basically, we are overlaying the idea of multiple questions being explored on top of that 7-point 3-act structure. Now, you might be saying, all right, but that requires taking a lot of route exclusive content like settings, characters, maps, and all that stuff. That's just too much stuff to create categorically for 3 different routes or however many routes you want to use in your game. No one except big studios with a lot of time and money can make all that extra content for exclusive routes where one perspective is explored versus a different one. Here's the beauty. If you're smart and have a plan from the start, you can make sure you're reusing characters, maps, and other assets that you've created for different routes for each one of the routes that the player is experiencing. This is getting very abstract, right? So let's have an example. And before I move on here, can everyone see the PowerPoint okay? Can everyone hear me okay?
I can.
Yes,
Okay.
it's great.
Hearing you
All right,
5x5.
Fantastic. All right. So let's make up a story. Let's make up a game. Let's make a dark fantasy game called Reaper. Reaper is a dark fantasy game where the player must work with ghosts to save the world. That's the elevator pitch. Key concepts are that ghosts linger in this world after they die. They don't move on to the afterlife. And that Reapers can gain power from ghosts. Okay. So Reaper has a big question at its heart. And that question is, What are our obligations to other people slash ghosts? Because ghosts are still people. This is a very broad question, but at its heart is a very relevant concern. When a person has power, how should they use it? To help others? To gain influence over others? With Reaper, the game has three different answers to the main question. First one at the top of the pyramid: we cannot survive without others. We are stronger together. Second, our only obligation is to enslave or dominate others. Is not to enslave or dominate others. Apologies. And the final one is we have no obligations to others. Individual will is everything. At first glance, this looks similar to most RPG morality systems. The top is the good path, the left corner is the neutral one, and the bottom right is the evil one. However, as the game goes on, these assumptions are going to get challenged. Now, we could simply focus on creating three different narrative routes based on these ideas by themselves. That would be simple and relatively, easy. However, we're designing a game here. And the wonderful thing about video games is that you can evoke your themes through gameplay. So for each one of these three answers to the central question, what are our obligations to other people? What are our obligations to the ghosts around us? Let's say we have three different archetypes for players to approach the game. They don't have to choose one to follow the entire game, but their decisions will eventually put them in one of these, categories. There's a weaver who binds ghosts to themselves temporarily. It gives them some passive buffs. The downside is if they lose their ghosts, then they're fragile and kind of um, kind of a glass cannon. The Oath Keeper, he doesn't mess around with ghosts. He just sends them immediately to the afterlife. When he goes down, he reaches 0 HP. Maybe he enters like a berserk mode, and he's much more powerful without the help of any ghost at all. The downside, of course, is that he's going to be constantly trying to juggle his HP with managing enemies. And then finally, you have the Maw. This is the PC that consumes the build that consumes ghosts. They choose the option that no one matters except my personal power. They eat ghosts, they become one with them, and they become extremely tanky. They become very buff. Downside is they have to consume a lot of ghosts to get to that level. So each of these archetypes line up with one of the answers to the game's central questions. And it's embodied in the central gameplay mechanics for that archetype. Oh, apologies. This should actually be a Oathkeeper, not Fairy. So the Weaver makes themselves stronger by using ghosts to augment their abilities. The Maw says, I don't care about the other's well-being. All I care about is my personal strength. And the Oathkeeper says, I'm not going to dominate or enslave anyone. I'm just going to operate by myself. So this brings us to our second narrative design principle. Oh, sorry. A game's mechanics, narrative, and themes should align. And I'll say that again. A game's mechanics, narrative, and themes should align. All right. So we've figured out our central question for this game. We figured out a couple answers that are divergent, but unique. And we figured out some gameplay that can be linked to those answers. Let's talk about our villain. Let's say the villain wants to kill all the living people and merge the mortal and ghost world, then collapse all their souls into one big soul so that there's no self or other, no pain of separation, no masters or slaves. If you've watched Neon Genesis Evangelion, this will be familiar to you. This is essentially a fourth answer to the game's central question. When asked what our relationship to ghosts and other people should be, the villain's answer is that there should be no divide between the self and the other. Of course, this will wipe out all individuality and wipe out the realm of the living, so understandably, most people in the narrative are going to be against it. All right. We've done a lot of preparations and big picture thinking about themes, questions, and gameplay. Now let's look at how this narrative might be put into practice so we can kind of fit it all together. This image is going to be key for us throughout this part of the presentation because it's essentially our recipe for key events: the call, the setup, the turning point, the lowest point, the rally, the finale, and the ending. So if you haven't already like screenshotted this or made some notes, here's your second to truly look at this and take it all in. Okay. So first off, we have the call. It's similar to the traditional call to adventure. It's where the hero is plucked out of normal life and takes on a greater role. This is where the player is introduced to the world, the supporting characters, their role as a reaper, the threat, and the stakes. In story terms, this is your exposition. It's where you put all the information in the player's head, and you make sure that they understand what's going on. Next is the setup. In game terms, this is where the player gets a feel for the game's mechanics, starts to get caught up in the gameplay loop, and begins to level up and make some choices about their archetype. To restate, in this world, Reapers are basically mages who can communicate and control ghosts. Their main function is to help ghosts pass on to the afterlife, but some of them choose to use ghosts as tools. Weavers bind ghosts to their service, Maws consume ghosts to make themselves stronger, and Oathkeepers just help them pass on. The player is going to interact with these archetypes and eventually choose one that fits them best. This is important because this is the part of the story when the player's archetype begins to play a kind of a role in the character interactions and story beats. It's also where we start to see the overall thesis of the narrative become a little bit more prominent, is in the setup. Once the players start to kind of choose what archetype most appeals to them, they should start understanding what that archetype says about the world. Okay. Next up is going to be the turning point. The turning point is when things start to get serious. A large chunk of the game has been spent getting the player ready to face their first real challenge, and this is where the stakes are going to be really put into play. In this case, let's say the villain wants to control a place called the Well of Souls, a temple that serves as a haven for ghosts. He's going to get in there, he's going to capture some ghosts that will help him open a portal to the realm of the dead, and it'll help further his plan, and then he's going to leave. So, if the Well of Souls is going to be our turning point for the hero, then we need to make sure that it's one, unique to the player's archetype, and two, basically accomplishing the kind of goal we set out to do, which is have the villain arrive, attempt to gather these ghosts, and then leave. Depending on the player's character build of Weaver, Oathkeeper, or Maw, you could have the narrative split. And in fact, I would recommend it because this is a key part of the narrative. The gameplay or the story itself should split so that so the player character is experiencing a different route. In this case, it means that gameplay is going to change. For a Weaver character, they might be sent in ahead of the villain to collect ghosts for aid. They might be told to collect them and get them out of the villain's grasp, and they might have to defend the Well of Souls from the villain's minions in kind of like a wave defense. Um, for the Oathkeeper, labeled on the presentation as Fairy, they might have to infiltrate the well with like a sneak mission while it's being occupied by the villain's forces and help the ghosts escape to the afterlife before the villain can take them. And for the Maw, they might have to race against time to consume as many of the ghosts in the Well of Souls as possible before they're taken by the villain. And I've made this, kind of crude map here to show how even the way that the player approaches this level might differ. You might have the Maw and Weaver players marked with a red and blue line come in the same way and exit the same way, but change paths within the well. Whereas the Oathkeeper might take the opposite route, where he comes in through a back entrance, works his way towards the front. So this is just a really crude example of how you can change basically the gameplay experience of the players by changing how to approach the same map with roughly the same general thesis. There's a villain coming, and you have to sabotage his plans. It also provides a map that can be used three different ways: for a wave defense, for a stealth mission, and for like a time trial that counts down to a boss fight. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about multifaceted narratives, being able to reuse assets in ways that mean you're not wasting, all the time and effort you put into one route. You can reuse them in one's place. Now, eventually, the villain confronts the player character at the Well of Souls, and they're going to defeat them in a desperate battle. More importantly, the villain is going to contradict the player character's archetype and its answer to the game's central question. To the Weaver, he might say that the PC is not an ally to the ghosts that they're taking on, they're a tyrant. For the Oathkeeper, they might say that they're not strong enough by themselves. And for the Maw, the villain might say that the PC is an abomination for consuming other people's souls. This is where the player realizes they're outclassed and can't defeat the villain as they are now. And it also shows that the villain is in direct conflict with the archetype that they've kind of chosen as their character, as well as the philosophical ramifications that belong to that archetype. Not only did the villain just beat your player, they said, "You're wrong about the world." And finally, as a final insult, the PC has their power taken away from them by the villain. For the Weaver, they might lose all their ghosts. For the Oathkeeper, they might lose their ability to stay alive even at 0 HP. And for the Maw, they might have all the souls sucked out of them. To clarify, if I say PC, that means player character, not personal computer. All right, so the turning point leads to a downfall. It leads to the nadir or lowest point of the story. This is not a happy time, and this is where this narrative structure, with the 3-act dramatic structure, differs from the Freitag triangle. However, all you need to worry about is that the turning point leads inevitably to the lowest point. At this point, the PC player character is left helpless in the Well of Souls as the villain leaves, and the villain has achieved what they came out here to get. The player character is approached by by friends and allies who are disappointed by the hero's failure. The player gets hit with the shame and guilt from being defeated. If you want to make it really bad, you could say the PC has their Reaper title removed and they get sidelined. They're not even a hero anymore because they failed so bad that they're not even part of the struggle. This leaves your player character helpless, useless, and hopeless. The villain seems to have won, and the ideals that were driving them as a Reaper have let them down. Or the ideals that were driving your player character, not the villain. That would be insane. Now, this is a critical moment because something needs to spur the player character out of this funk and convince them to try to keep fighting. In this case, let's say the player character is approached by a character that they dismissed or disliked earlier, who gives them some advice, tells them that they need to keep fighting, and that there's a sage out there in the wilderness that may be able to give them the help and the power that they need to defeat the villain. If you don't have that turning point that comes out of the lowest point, no possible thread of hope that the player can cling to, they're going to get disheartened. So it's a very key moment. It's when the story starts to go back up again at the very end of the lowest point. And this leads us to the next stage, the rally. This is going to be our next big story branch as well. It's where the PC goes to a new location, meets new characters, but which location and characters they meet are going to change based on their archetype. This brings us to narrative design principle number 3. The story should make major branches at key moments in the dramatic structure, not arbitrarily. A lot of games just give you divergent paths that don't really matter too much, but they give the illusion of having agency. When you tie the branching narrative to key moments in the game, that's when they start to feel meaningful and impactful. Your player character has felt hopeless and useless, and now they're trying to decide, where do I go from here? That's when your story should branch. During the rally, the PC regains their resolve, they take a new path, they meet a mentor or a teacher that helps them, and more importantly, they gain a deeper understanding of their self and their abilities. Here's just a really rough outline of what a rally could look like. In this story, the player character goes on a journey in search of a sage who resides in a different land. Could be a snowy mountain, could be a forest, could be a desert. It depends on which archetype they are. Along the way, they're going to face new enemies, explore new maps, experience route specific content like cutscenes. These areas and some of their assets are going to be reused in the other routes, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Eventually, the player finds their sage, which turns out to be a ghost. Oh, wow, big twist. The ghost they meet will depend on their archetype and their route, but that ghost will represent a new perspective on the three answers to the central question of the game. And remember, those three answers to the central question are the three different archetypes. So, for example, if the player takes the Weaver route, the ghost might tell them that yes, the collective is stronger than the individual, but you shouldn't force people to join you, just like you shouldn't bind ghosts against their will to make yourself more powerful. For the Oath Keeper, the ghost might say that enslaving ghosts or people is not acceptable, but in times of crisis, it's okay to borrow and wield their power to defend them. And for the Maw, the ghost might say that love is stronger than anything, and love is basically two or more people who fuse together to become something unified but new and distinct. So in that sense, the Maw is basically learning how to love. What you'll notice is that each of these sages are borrowing slightly from the philosophies of the other archetypes, basically synthesizing two different viewpoints that make the original one more nuanced. The Oath Keeper is kind of being influenced by the philosophy that was originally given to the Maw, that it's okay to take people's power for yourself, but only as a defender. Whereas the Oath Keeper before would be like, no, I'm never going to override someone's will or take control of them. I mean, this is very high level, weaving together different themes and ideas. But what this essentially represents is a transformation of the character, both internal and external. They've taken a new dimension on their archetype. They've approached the question of the game in a different way, and they're learning a new way to approach how they view the world. So I'll give you guys a second to write some of that down. To restate, during the rally, the player character should be taking on a new perspective on the path that they've been taking for the previous part of the game. They should be experiencing a new perspective that changes who they are internally as well as externally. And externally is basically how their powers manifest and how they approach the game. Okay. This brings us to the next part of the rally where the PC is going to practice what they've learned. They've gotten the new insight from the sage. They think that they've got a new handle on what they can do and who they are. And now they're going to face some challenges. This is usually represented by a training montage in movies, but here it means that we can have the PC travel to the lands that they weren't visiting in the other routes. So you can transform the sages that you would meet in the other routes into mini bosses. You can put the map that you created for those routes. You can give that to the player to explore now in a different perspective, and you can give the creatures and challenges in those places to the player as here, fight this, overcome this, and essentially they're seeing the same routes, all the same content as they would if they took the Oathkeeper route or the Maw route, but they're experiencing them from the perspective of being a weaver. So when you create multiple routes, you should be reusing characters, maps, and challenges, but recontextualizing them based on the player's choices. An enemy in one section might be an ally in another route, and so on. And you can see that narrative design principle listed down below. Multifaceted stories can facilitate the reuse of assets, so on and so forth. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've gotten through the first two acts of our dramatic structure. We've gone through the call, the setup, the turning point, which had a little branch, the lowest point, and then the rally, which had a really big branch. Along the way, the player character has changed the way that they look at themselves, the answers to the fundamental question of the game, And maybe their powers have even changed a little bit. Maybe the way the game mechanics are manifested has changed. So that brings us to Act 3. That means it's time for the finale and the ending. So, for the finale, we're dealing with a player character here who has been transformed. They're not the same as they were when they started. They look different oftentimes. They act different. If you want a good example of this, it's like Luke Skywalker changing his outfit for the third movie. He wears black now. He has a new lightsaber, and he's much more like sage-like than the young farm boy we met in the beginning. In the finale, they face off against the villain, and this is to make the really stakes the highest that they can be. This will be the last chance to salvage the world from disaster. The PC, as they face the villain, is going to embody the new complicated answer that they have come to for the key question of the game. For the Maw, it could be that love is more powerful than being selfish. For the Weaver, it might be that we're stronger together, but there's no masters, there's no servants. And for the Oathkeeper, it might be that yes, I am respectful of other people's power and their livelihood, but I am not alone anymore. So let's set the scene here. The villain's plan is in full swing, and the mortal realm and the realm of the dead are merging. Soon, everyone's going to be dead, and all the souls are going to merge into one. The player arrives with new abilities and a new resolve, but let's say there's an obstacle keeping them from wailing on the big villain. Maybe it's a magical artifact or part of a ritual merging the land of the living and dead, but the villain is, for some reason, invincible as long as the player doesn't remove the obstacle. This offers an opportunity for the player to make another key choice in the game. If they want to kill this villain and save the world, they have to make a difficult decision. Let's say they have three choices. Let's see. They could cross over into the land of the dead and rally the ghosts there to help them. They could suck up all the ghosts in the land of the dead and become like a god, or they could seal off the land of the dead forever. Whatever they decide, they pull it off. They defeat the villain. Hooray! But here's the thing. Based on the player's decision during that fight, they've changed the world. They haven't just preserved the status quo, they've changed it. And this is important. Even though it's the end of the game and there may or may not be a sequel, the player has to feel like their choice had an impact. Even if it's just a short epilogue, it gives narrative closure to the player. In this case, we could say there's three different endings. Maybe when they rally the land of the dead, the boundary between life and death becomes blurred, and ghosts begin reincarnating after the villain is defeated. If they consumed all those ghosts to become a god, maybe they fix the realm between life and death, but they have to die in the process. And if they pulled all the ghosts into the realm of the living and sealed off the land of the dead, maybe ghosts and the living now have to live together. So each one of these represents a key change to the world that was chosen by the player. And though they're not connected to the central question of the game, what's our connection to others, what's our connection to ghosts, they represent the beginning of a new chapter. Something where the player says, wow, I really had an impact on history. Okay. So we've come to the end of the story here. We've covered a lot of ground again. We basically outlined an entire game, and that includes three major branches. If we create a rough outline of the game, it would look something like this. Now, you can create additional mainline branches and even create some nested branches in something like this if you want, but that's up to you. What's important is that you keep these principles in mind. So if you want a chance to write those down, there they are. The first one is that the different routes coexist. The different answers to the question can exist in the same world, and those define your routes. The second one is that if you do it correctly, multifaceted stories like this can facilitate the reuse of assets. So it's not just, oh, I put all the time into this character, this map, this creature. No one's going to see it because it's locked off to this route. If you do it correctly and smartly, you can reuse a lot of the stuff that you've created, which overcomes one of the big hurdles for people who say narrative design shouldn't be too complicated. And then finally, stories, game mechanics, narratives, and themes should align. I really can't stress this enough, but it's always going to be difficult, you understand, because you're a narrative designer or you're working on a game story, and the programmer or game team is going to be split doing other things. And they may not come to you and say, how can we link these things together? But if you have the chance and the opportunity to make them align, you should always, always do it. And finally, the principle number 4, your story should make major branches at key moments in the dramatic structure, not just arbitrarily. These are where the branches are going to be the most important, is at that lowest point, turning point, rally, and finale. That's also where you have the most impactful story moments. So, of course, the most impactful decisions are going to happen there. Okay. So, if you're looking at me and you're saying, all right, I want to do this, I want to make a story like you've described. How do I do that? The answer is you're going to need some more help than just a legal pad and a pen. The things I've described, even at the most basic level, are complicated. And to keep it all straight and make sure that it's able to be revised and changed as the story develops, as you move on through the development cycle, you need to have some tools that can help guide you along and make sure that your narrative outline is manageable. So let's talk through very quickly some options. The first one is Twine. Now, Twine is good for first time narrative designers because it helps you do a little bit of coding. It helps you understand branching narratives on a very basic level. It's free, it's open source, and it's pretty easy to use as a beginner. However, Twine isn't used for outlining narratives. It's actually used to make interactive games with text, basically like a choose your own adventure story. And you can implement some stories with pictures, videos, but it's not the best for outlining a story. It's great for your first dip into narrative design and understanding how branches work. The problem with using it as an outline tool is that it's cumbersome to revise. There's a lot of coding problems and complexities that you need to learn if you're trying to do more advanced stuff. I personally use Twine to outline basic stories that I'm thinking about, um, but it's more of a baby's first narrative design tool than a great outliner. Next up, we have Scapple, which is very simple. It's extremely easy to learn. You may have seen it earlier in the presentation. You just create nodes by double clicking on a big white space. You connect the nodes by dragging nodes on top of each other to make a line between them. And you can change the colors of the bubbles around the words. That's about it. If you want a really simple outlining tool, though, it's great. The only downside is that's 18 bucks to purchase, and that doesn't have much more features than what I've just described. But if you just need to map stuff out and get things down in your head, get things in your head down on paper, Scapple is a pretty good tool. Then finally, we have the big boy, Scrivener. If you've worked in novels or book publishing, maybe you've heard of this. Scrivener is essentially a super in depth outlining tool with multiple ways to view your narratives and your outlines. You can see here in like the PowerPoint that there's basically a bunch of nested folders that keep each part of your narrative in organized spaces. The big advantage is that it has 3 ways to approach the documents that you put in it. You can see it as the editor, which is where you type things. You put in images into like a WordPress sort of text editor. There's an outline form, which allows you to just see like the chapter headings, chapter subheadings, and just see the big structure of it. Then there's a corkboard, which you can see on the right side of the PowerPoint, which allows you to kind of map things out visually. This person put them into 2 columns, but you can arrange them any way you want. There's a lot of space for notes, for synopses that you can put in here. It's very, very feature intensive with a lot of depth and flexibility, and it's very robust when it comes to the options it gives you as a narrative designer. However, the downside is that it's $50 and that it's time consuming to learn all this stuff. There's a lot of features, a lot of small things that you can really dig into and use it to its full power. But most people are just going to be using it to arrange, like, all right, here's the first point, here's the second chapter, here's the fourth chapter. Um, that being said, I think Scrivener would probably be best for those doing very long and complicated projects because it gives you the cleanliness and the space that you need to really revise things and to remove things around. Um, and that's all I have to say about outlining tools. So we're going to move on to the last slide. This is a little self plug, but before we get into that, I just want to thank all of you for listening to this talk. And for those of you watching, the stream or the video, this has been some really high level narrative design concepts and some very nitty gritty game design, basically a crash course in it. So congrats to you for making through it. And if you want to go back and look through what I was saying about different points, if you weren't able to get it all, that's okay. We basically crammed an entry level course in narrative design into a 40 to 45-minute video. So if it seems confusing, you can't keep it all in your head straight, that's natural. That's what happens when you're just approaching this stuff. So don't be discouraged, and make sure that when you're writing your narratives that you don't compromise on complexity, on ingenuity, on the the passion that you have for your projects. I know there's a lot of forces in game design, especially high level professional game work, where they say narrative doesn't matter; it's a second consideration. But don't believe it. Games matter, stories matter, and players react to them. Which brings me to my current project. Recently, I became the creative lead on a project that I created called Black Heaven, a Necromantic Dating Sim. It's a visual novel in the style of a dating sim. And I basically went all out with all the kind of cool stuff that I wish I could do with other narrative projects. One of the core features is that if you try to undo your past actions by reloading a save, the actual narrative will change. You'll see different scenes, and the game will remember what you've done, even if you try to change it. It has 3 simultaneous romance paths, so it has 3 paths happening roughly at the same time. So some events will cross over, regardless of what path you've chosen. Some events will be common to all of them. And finally, it has like a free-form sort of choose your own route structure later on, where you can basically put together narrative as a puzzle, and you can start where you decide to start. So it's very much like piecing together a jigsaw. Um, if you've never played a visual novel or have any cares about dating sims, I'd say check it out, just because I was never a huge fan of dating sims until I started really getting into them. So we're going to be having a Kickstarter launch on April 30th. That's in 3 days. I think one of the attendees here, Merrick Domagala, actually did the music for it. So if you want to see basically a playground for narrative design in action, check out Black Heaven. And if you want to try it yourself, check out the RenPy engine and visual novels. If you want to just focus on making your narratives as interesting and as polished as possible. All right, guys, that's all I got. I'm out of material.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. Does anybody have any questions? We'll open the floor.
Any questions out there? It's okay to be the first one.
Do we just throw them out?
Yeah, just go for it. First come, first serve.
All right. Well, thank you for an excellent presentation. A lot to think about here. A lot of really good information to process. My question is one of the models that I'd heard, and I suppose it's probably closest to like the Freitag pyramid, is 3C, which is choice, challenge or content, and then consequence. So you present the player a choice, you give them, when they've chosen something, that then has something that happens in between, and then at the end there's some sort of payoff. And I think it's probably more typical of something like a choose your own adventure type story, where you get your choice at the bottom of the page, go to page 6, go to page 9. On page 6 or page 9, you've got that content or that challenge, and then I guess turning the page is probably the consequence. So I'm just curious, in a story that is sort of continuously moving forward, how do you build consequences on top of each other where
Yeah, I see where you're going with this, but please finish your thought.
well, it's I guess, yeah, how do you prevent all of that from coming tumbling down in some sort of gigantic pyramid or house of cards, or I don't know.
So it's basically the problem of, if every choice has meaningful consequences to it, how do you weave together the consequences from different routes or choices into one narrative? Is that what you're saying?
That's one, and then two, just how do you manage the volume of branches you've suddenly created?
Yeah, this is a big problem with the end point of games like Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, as well as a narrative design problem with how do you be efficient with your time and resources. The answer to the first question, how do you make sure that the consequences don't all basically build up on top of each other to the point where they've changed the story so much that nothing can be the same, that there's no unifying thread or status quo to return to. The answer would be, you choose your consequences very carefully, and you choose how they manifest. Um, an easy way to have consequences for a character's action that don't affect other routes is basically to make the consequences internal or character development related, rather than world related or externally related. So, for example, if they fail to stop a moving train and save all the people on board, you don't show the giant mess of a train and the wiped out cityscape from the aftermath. You show the guilt in the player character and how it's changed the way that they um, act and behave. So the answer to the first question is just, you have to be very careful about how to delineate how much consequences overlap with one another. As for the second question, how to manage all those branching consequences. This is where outlining something with Scrivener or Scapple will help you see the potential obstacles with overlapping consequences, and help you manage basically the fallout of having a lot of big impactful decisions. Um, you either you have to muddle through all the complications and try to get back to a status quo that's acceptable, or you just make the consequences as siloed off as possible. Um, it really comes down to how much time and resources you want to put into manifesting those consequences. Does that answer your question at all, or am I missing the?
I think it does. And yeah, it's much appreciated. I think the idea of keeping it internal rather than world affecting, or even perhaps not even telling the player what the consequence is until much
Yeah.
much later, would help both provide that feeling of like, I made a decision. It felt like it had some weight to it,
Yeah.
but also minimize the impact on everything surrounding it.
Sure. All right. Do we have another question?
I had a question about
Yep.
representing. Well, first of all, props. This is a fantastic lecture. It was so efficient and like chock full of good advice. I really appreciate that.
Oh, I'd love to hear it.
um, I love the key insight of making, if you're trying to correlate the visual graph and you see where the branches are and you're aligning them to this 3-act structure that if you're a playwright or if you're a feature film writer, you've got baked into your DNA. Realizing that is where that happens is so that's like the biggest insight for me. I think I underlined it a couple times. If you are charting this and you have an allegory to something that is a grand epic scale RPG, but the game is sort of like famous for also the sandbox potential. I guess you could consider it like a Dragon Age or Grand Theft Auto. There kind of is a major story that you're going on, but they're always also dangling the side quests. And so are those basically the parts that look like the tree is just exploding into very short branches, or when you're
Yes.
just when you're doing that, do you just kind of like even just have like a mass of seaweed off to the side? Like is it helpful to visually represent that for yourself? And if so, how do you handle that?
Yeah, I definitely think if you're looking at the kind of structure for Grand Theft Auto, for Dragon Age, and side quests, they're going to look more like, and I'm going to change the slide on the PowerPoint back to a previous one. They're going to look something like this, the kind of Skyrim example. And yeah, the example of seaweed is, I think, an apt one because they just sort of end in little tendrils. Then you go back to the original branch, or sorry, the original route, um, the main kind of route for the story. For those sorts of side quests, I would say having a plot cul-de-sac, as some people call it, is useful. Basically saying, "Wow, you've done it. Now go back." Um, but something like this is that's what these sorts of narrative structures are going to look like, sort of like branching routes that end where the quest lines or the side quest ends.
Awesome. I love the cul-de-sac metaphor. Thank you.
Yeah, props to Dan Olson from Folding Ideas for bringing that into my vocabulary. That's a great YouTube channel. You should check it out. Um, but yeah, anyone else got a question? Hit that buzzer. Anybody else got questions about stories or game design? No? Well, I'm giving you guys 10 seconds. If you have any burning questions, even if you don't know how to phrase them correctly, now's your chance.
Everyone should check out how people have plotted. It's kind of like the diagram with the red, blue, and green arrows. Look for the plots of the storyline of Tenet online.
It's a good shout out for Tenet. All right, guys. Oh, you got one?
No, I'm just going to thank you once more for giving us and it's great. Thanks. Learned a lot.
All right.
And by the way, it's all on our, for those of you that came late, we have it on our YouTube channel, so you can watch the whole thing there at your leisure.
And I'm just going to leave a link for the Kickstarter for Black Heaven if anyone wants to check it out. If anybody wants to talk to me about my work and about narrative design, I'll be here on Discord. Other than that, thank you guys so much for being an excellent audience. Thank you for very insightful questions. And never let the light die in your eyes. Follow the dream.
Thanks again, Chris. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.
Yep.